And we decided to create what it's called the Democratic Education Needs Imagination Initiative, DENI, which the idea was to gather a diverse group of people from a variety of points of view and expertise in education from around the world to think together about how educational systems and practices can be imagined to overcome these challenges and promote democratic strength, reduce polarization, and lack of intergroup conversation. So in this way, the idea was, on the one hand, to better understand how we could contribute to do our projects to be crafted, to be more efficient and successful and have a better impact. And at the same time, to identify what were the challenges that we were facing in a much more coordinated manner and try to find solutions towards those those challenges, And we also had an important, one of the motivations that was also behind this was to connect with people from all over the world that were in a similar situation, sharing some of our concerns, and we're trying to do work to overcome these issues. So the project had several phases. In a first moment, we commissioned 12 case studies from education experts from all over the world. We wanted to have a variety of points of view. So we wanted to have academics, but also people working in civil society, policymakers. So have like a little bit of different perspectives in terms of the field of work. And we also wanted to have like an international scope to this work. So we commissioned these papers from people from Finland, El Salvador, Colombia, the United States, Brazil, Ghana, Tanzania, Qatar, Thailand, Spain, and Ukraine. So talking about Ukraine, I just wanted to say hi to Natalia, our participant from Ukraine, who I know is watching us today, and send her all our support and our best wishes considering the difficult situation Ukraine is living in this war that just started a couple of months ago. So going back to the structure, the 12 case studies were also intentional. We did like a concept note prior to the commissioning of the case studies to identify which were the issues and also to identify who were the people we would want to be asking to write these papers. And we identified 4 clusters, 4 thematic areas of work. The first one was related to competencies, so knowledge, attitudes, and skills that need to be nurtured in this context. The second one was around classroom-based strategies and methodologies, looking into pedagogical approaches that should be used or can be used to enhance certain skills. We also looked into the school culture and how schools are part of broader communities and how that interrelates to build a stronger school cultures. And finally, we also looked into the educational policies and planning component. So to also understand how from a policy making this issue was being tackled. With these papers, we organized a global conference that took place in November, in which we invited additional practitioners and experts to discuss with us these papers and try to get some outcome out of these discussions, which is the report that we are introducing today, presenting here, which has been translated in 4 languages. So it's English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French, and which tries in a way to summarize what we discussed there. Of course, not all could be represented, but at least kind of establish a shared position of those discussions. The authors had the opportunity to read the report in advance and provide feedback. So it was always a very, it was at all moments a collaborative process in the making. So the idea of this report is to serve as a practical evidence-based tool for practitioners, policymakers, funders alike on the type of possible mechanisms for leveraging education as a preventive tool, but also being aware of some of the gaps that may need to be overcome in order to make this work possible. And in a way, and as things have been developing, it's also very much an invitation to an open discussion and to include more people who are interested in this conversation to promote future work. And that's one of the reasons we are doing this event, we will be doing some other localized events, and why we also want to learn a little bit more about you, if you want to share in the chat who you are, and see whether that would be any possibility of working together in the future as well. Very briefly, because our panelists are going to be in much better shape than me to talk about the findings of the report. The report is structured around 4 key findings and 4 obstacles, as we have called them, which in a way was like the result of, after all these discussions, and with some differences, of course, but like gathering all these people from all over the world, we saw that there was a shared understanding of what we were talking about, and a lot of evidence that, you know, this work is being done and that it actually works. We know from our own work that these kind of projects in which we try to work with young people about the values of human rights, pluralism, respect, do have an impact and do actually contribute to create more resilient societies. But at the same time, we saw that it was not a lack of formulas, but actually some external and internal obstacles that in many occasions hinder this work. So in terms of what works, we crafted a continuum of strategies that do reinforce this democratic, pluralistic, open education that goes exactly from the curricula, what is being taught, the pedagogies, how it's being taught, and where it's being taught, the school cultures. So there is a continuum in terms of what is taught and how it's taught and where it's taught, and it's actually contributing to promote certain changes and have some positive impact in young people. And there was also an important part of strengthening the role of teachers that also came as a key finding, which is also something we've been talking so many times about, and the importance of giving tools to teachers in order to be able to effectively do this work, and especially in a world in which we know that teachers are not treated socially, nor in many ways as they should be treated. So these were kind of the positive, or like the more conclusions that we arrived to. And then we identified 4 key obstacles. The first one related to the idea of the lack of a strong consensus on what democratic education is, what it does, and what should constitute. Recognizing that education for democracy is a topic that tends to provoke controversy and heated debates, not only among those who practice similar types of educations, but of course against those that straightforward think that this type of education shouldn't have any space in the school, which is a different level and much more problematic, of course. But the idea was that as a consequence of this controversy, education tends to be conservative and adverse to change. There's a difficulty to build agreements, and that makes us kind of be focusing in short-term debates rather than looking for longer-term structural changes, especially in the policy-making arena, which in the situation in which we're living, it also poses us a question in terms of how democracies are going to survive, considering that we are not doing the homework from our educational systems. The second obstacle related to siloed policies and policies and processes between the states and schools. So even when there's frameworks in which there is an agreement about these kind of processes, that's not necessarily reflected in that conversation between the policy level making and the implementation level. And sometimes there's even contradictions among those 2 levels that may have not only result in inefficiency, but also having harmful effects for what it's actually learned in the schools. We also discussed about poor accountability systems in how educational policies are crafted, and these we discuss very much in relation to the expansion of the influence of private actors in the education sector that at the end of the day respond to other logics and are not part or are not accountable into the democratic system in the traditional ways in which democracies make accountable people who make decisions. And the idea that this phenomena, it's also very much linked to the increasing pressure of the education systems in demonstrate through standardized test scores that students are prepared to join the job market. And this is not only a question of whether these tests are adequately measuring what we call as these competencies and skills for democratic education, but also how this test system and this way of understanding education promotes a competitive model of learning rather than one based in cooperation or in promoting critical thinking. So in a way, it's not only a phenomenon, that it's a phenomenon that can be studied, but it also has consequences on how the educational system is crafted and it's made accountable, and what the role of education in societies that are promoting democratic values should be. And finally, very much related to this, it's the uneven state funding and prioritization of democratic education. So in a way, we discussed that the way in which political systems deal with the value, the space they give to these approaches to education in their educational realm is a symbolic decision. In a way, you're saying, how seriously do you take the creation of autonomous, independent, critical citizens that can promote deeper democratization? So we see that there is not always a consistent support in terms of funding, teacher training, all these issues that states do or even tackling the issue and really trying to promote an agreement about these topics rather than keep playing the party politics game to really take this issue as seriously as it should be taken. And this also goes to private foundations, like for some of us in the group that work for civil society organizations. We've seen that recently some of the most important supporters of the kind of work that we do are closing their education programs. And this is not just one, but it's been more than one. And this is something that it's, in a way, for us that really feel this work has very important value. It's actually very worrisome. So kind of to say, the conclusion of this conference was, we did have a space of sharing among people that are doing similar work, and found that we think that from our experience, the same things that we are practicing are working. There can be different curriculums, but they all in the end do have similar aims in mind, and they do have the effects. And the problem, the obstacles we are facing to promote this kind of work are in another place. And this is why this report, we want to understand it as also a call to action and try to articulate with other people that are feeling as we are in terms of the work we are doing. And I hope I was not too long. Without further ado, I'm just going to pass it to our panelists, which actually are going to say all this much better than me. And actually, I am very happy, and we are all very privileged to have here with us Fernande Raine. So Fernande is led by a lifelong conviction that history can be a fuel for a new, inclusive, democratic culture. She obtained her history PhD from Yale University, and early in her career worked as a consultant with McKinsey and Innosight. She ran the Human Rights Center at Harvard's Kennedy School and launched and led the Measurement in Human Rights project. She also launched 5 programs during 11 years as an entrepreneur at Ashoka and co-led the research effort into system change and leadership. Welcome, Fernande. I am also going to introduce Jan Boontinand from Mahidol University, where she is director and lecturer at the Institute of Human Rights and Peace Studies. She did her PhD research looking at school culture and curriculum in Thailand, and how they contributed to or hindered development of democratic citizenship. Her current research focuses in the area of democratic citizenship, education in higher education, critical theory, and pedagogy. And she's currently the chair of the Thai Civic Education Foundation. We also have with us Olga Lúcia Zárate Mantilla, who works at the Ministry of Education in Colombia, where she was part of the team that led the decentralization process of the education sector. As a consultant, she has led several projects to promote democratic participation of young people. She also led the implementation of a series of initiatives to promote student participation at the Mercosur Youth Parliament and to strengthen the regional system for the evaluation and development of citizen competencies with Colombia, Costa Rica, and Mexico. And she's part of the UNESCO Latin American Network for Holocaust and Genocide Education and the Regional Network of Education for Global Citizenship of Latin America and the Caribbean. And last but not least, we also have Tuija Kasa with us from the University of Helsinki, where she is actually pursuing a PhD with a dissertation on human rights education in the doctoral program of School, Education, Society, and Culture from the University of Helsinki. And she works as a part-time expert in the Human Rights Center of Finland. Her doctoral dissertation focuses on democratic education and political polarization in the era of global crises. And previously, she worked as a project planner in human rights, democracy, values, and dialogue in education at the University of Helsinki, developing democracy and human rights education for teachers. So I'm just going to pass it now to you, Andy, to start the conversation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Clara, for that kind of introduction to both the project and the report and some of those findings. And absolutely agree that I think for me, what was really exciting is it became a call to action, which wasn't necessarily how we went into this. I think we went in thinking that this would be about identifying some of that kind of what works in creating respectful, inclusive communities where identity-based violence is less likely through education, and perhaps came out the other end realizing that there's lots of agreement on that, but it's the barriers that stand in the way that are the thing we really need to focus our attention on overcoming. But I think we'll come to all of that. And I'd really like to start, Jan, with you, if I could, and thinking about that first bit around that what works, around that, like, what are the pedagogies and the ways that the curricula can be developed as a tool for democratic participation or the prevention of identity-based violence. What were those takeaways for you on actually where everyone was agreeing on the things that work, the ways that we can create those kind of education systems in ways that are really beneficial to creating those communities we're talking about? And those, what are the processes inside and outside the school?
Okay, thanks very much, Andy. I guess I'll be brief because we're supposed to have a conversation, so I'll just try to keep myself quite short. But I think there are many takeaways from the conference that we had, but I would like to share three main ones that I think are important for us to reflect on. The first one, I felt like despite the diversity of our context in terms of socially, culturally, politically, or economically in the groups that had the conversation during the conference, we kind of were able to agree that curricula and pedagogical practices should promote a set of core competencies that Clara was talking about. So a kind of knowledge and attitude and skills that would enable young people to live in and to deal with the complexity of our world. And that's some of those things that's included in the report, including the understanding of human dignity, human rights, critical thinking, ability to disagree respectfully, empathy, curiosity, respect for oneself, others, and the environment. So I think there's been a lot of research about competencies, and I think we were kind of discussing, okay, what sets of competency do we agree on as core competency? I think despite the diversity that we came from, the backgrounds, I think these are some of the key ones that we could broadly agree on. But I think we also recognize that when we talk about competencies, we recognize that they are complex. I mean, they are interconnected. When we talk about knowledge, values, or attitude and skills, sometimes you cannot really separate them so much. There's no clear cut. So they are interconnected, and they're also dynamic in the sense that they are evolving. So in that sense, I think the important takeaway here is that learning needs to be contextualized, and it needs to be relevant to the lives of the young people. Whether we want to promote this, broad-based knowledge or attitudes and skill, how do we link those to the context where young people live? Because we all come from different society and different challenges that we face. So I think that's the first takeaway. And the second part is that learning takes place, learning for democracy and violence prevention takes place both inside and outside the classroom. So when we talk about education, we tend to think about the school compound and education in the four wall of the classrooms. But I think this conference really emphasize or kind of affirm that, when we talk about learning education, it's go beyond the walls of the schools. But the processes that we could learn and develop learning and pedagogy could be, I find that there are two important processes that took away with is the first one is that, to enable young people to engage in dialogue and meaningful interactions, especially with people who are different from them, those who come from different backgrounds and culture. I think in some societies like myself in Thailand, unfortunately, the schools are quite, it's not very homogeneous. You stay with your group, like middle class group, or kids in the rural areas, stay with them. So there's not a lot of opportunities to learn from different people and background. And even though maybe there are different people and background, there's not opportunities in the classroom that is facilitated for you to learn about one another in a meaningful way, because the learning focus on the content knowledge rather than learning about each other. So I think that is important. How do you facilitate that kind of space, and also learning particularly about the situation of some groups or identity groups that have been historically oppressed or have been the human rights violated? How do we sensitize young people about the outcomes of biases, intolerance, indifferences, and that's led to violence. So I think that's an important part in terms of curriculum and pedagogy that we need to engage in more. And the other part of that is a process of co-creation of learning between teachers and students, and also among the students themselves, because young people may feel more engaged, or they do feel more engaged when they talk about things that are important for them. So I think creating space for young people to think together and to think about what is important for them individually as a group, what kind of society they want to live in, what kind of people they want to become. I think this kind of inquiry and space would enable young people to really reflect and relate to one another in a more meaningful way. And the last takeaway for me is that we need to look at school as part of the larger ecosystem of learning and education. So again, this link to being inside and outside the classroom, but more and more, if we want to make education for democracy becomes really democratic, we need to engage in that larger ecosystem. And I think we all realize that we need to make school as communities, and how do we enhance that learning ecosystem to include the communities that live nearby? How do we engage with them? How to get young people to engage in the civic activities, can lead the activities that they care about and they want to see change. So I think that whole thing about linking education beyond the school and linking with the community, it can be very powerful in helping young people to learn about things beyond themselves, about what's very important in the community. So I think that's what I would like to share.
Well, thank you, Jan, for those points. And absolutely, I think that echoes so much what my takeaways from being involved in those conversations were. And I think what's really interesting, I mean, you've set out there a few things, and I was scribbling them down as you went, those kind of dialogue and meaningful interactions, those learning about prejudice and bias and histories and real histories, and obviously all of this being in the context that's necessary for where it's taking place. The co-creation of learning and seeing that school as part of a wider ecosystem. What struck me as part of the discussions, and as you were saying it then, and thinking about it, and perhaps something we can come back to in a bit, is I feel like certainly where we're based in London, in the UK, that we have lots of different names for what these kinds of learnings are called. And be that we've got, citizenship or civics or human rights education or restorative practices. And all these things are done in different schools by different organizations sometimes and educators. I think one of the things that came out for me is we struggle to have a shared language for what that is that we're talking about, perhaps. And we've in this report called it democratic education. I'm not sure that's the right language either, but it just strikes me as like we actually do know what lots of these ways of working are. And I think everyone here would probably agree on what you've just set out is the ways that we can prevent identity-based violence through education, is the way we can create those communities we want. But perhaps we often call it different things, and we find it hard to know what we should be calling it. Anyway, just my reflection on some of that. I must move on. And Tuija, I'm going to come to you if that's okay. And my question for you really is, I mean, obviously, students and young people are at the heart of what we're talking about. We're talking about how we equip students, talking about how we equip young people with the competencies that mean we can have those wonderful communities that we all want to be a part of. But obviously, teachers and educators are a huge part of that. And I don't think anyone here wants to put additional pressure on already overworked, underappreciated, under-resourced educators. I think that's not what we're necessarily saying, right? That actually if educators would just do better, then we'd have a better situation. But obviously educators do play a huge role. So I guess like for you and from the discussions we had and from the kind of work you've done in the past, where do educators come into this? How does teacher training intersect with education for democracy? How can we support educators in many ways to be able to do that work that Jan was just outlining more easily and better?
Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot for invitation. It's an honor to be here and have this discussion with you all. I try to not give a lecture here. I have many thoughts about it. So I have been especially working with teacher education previously. And for example, in Finland right now, there are many initiatives for children's and young people's participation, which is absolutely great. But I have been kind of recognizing in my research this kind of gap that teachers are not systematically supported for democracy and human rights education. And we also asked for student teachers, what do they think that should be done? And it's quite simple. Many say that we should also be explicit about democracy and human rights education. For example, in Finland, we might have many things that are connected in these values and encounters and promoting moral attitudes, which is a great thing. But at the same time, I think we need to really give the knowledge and understanding what does this mean, and also in relation to if we want to empower children in school and young people, we need the teachers, because in many ways teachers are the gatekeepers, or they hold the power, so they can really be progressive, or they can be reproducing the old power structures. So we should also be critical towards what do we mean by education. It's not always liberating. It can be also really bad for many groups. So we need support for teachers for specifically about these issues. And in my experience, for example, student teachers are really, they want to do it, but they also need space for it. So one good approach is to go to the, in a way, structural level, that it comes in a place where you have safe space to practice some of these skills and what does this knowledge mean, so that you don't, for example, just try to distribute the information when people are already in these busy classes. Of course, they need that also, but it's a complex issue. But there's a huge potential, and what I brought up in this report was that the young adults and students are really kind of hoping for this. Especially they promote democracy and human rights. They want to learn more and understand more, and they kind of see, I don't want to make this kind of too strict generational divisions, but they really see the importance in the modern diverse societies and the threats that are happening globally. So many people think that we schools need to change, and we need to support the change, but that's a big process. So maybe that's the main goal. I think teachers, to sum up, they need also space for critical thinking and for reflecting the diversity. So that you can have those kind of ideas in your head, and you can also relate them when you go to the schools.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think Clara's going to be asking the next question, if I might. But before you do, I just wanted to mention that I've been going through the chat and noticed we've got lots of people who have been involved in these conversations throughout and involved in the conference. Grace and Amanda, Natalia, who we've already kind of said hello to, Mara, Lakati, Adrian. So just wanted to sort of say hi and thanks for joining and for all the kind of effort you put into creating this report and hopefully what comes after.
Thank you, Andy. So Fernande, I'm going to ask you now, so we wanted to discuss with Tuija and with Jan a little bit about the findings in these different levels, but we, as I just briefly explained in the introduction, we also discussed about some of the challenges to democratic education, I mean, the lack of shared strategies, lack of challenges to find a consensus, but we also discussed about poor systems of accountability, and very much related to that, how a heavy focus on educational excellence, education becoming a commodity based on test-based assessments that are used to guide decision-making. So I would like to ask you, in what sense do you think this is posing a challenge to the democratic education ideal we discussed through the conference, and what we can do in order to try to balance this in a more positive manner?
Thank you so much for the question, Clara. And I'm just slightly terrified about the fact that, you have 5 minutes to answer the question of what can be done, right? Huge issues and huge challenge, but I've got this. I've 100% got this. And thank you for having this conversation. I think just echoing some of the things we've heard, I mean, I think some of the challenges, is this an obstacle to the democratic education ideal? 100%. And what are the sources of this? I think some of it is we stand in our own way. as the civic and democracy education field, right? We get very intent on our content, that we have different organizations have one content area that they really care about, or one theme, or one value. And in that competitive landscape of different civic education organizations, we often don't necessarily even help each other getting toward the same goal, because we're so focused on the specificities of what we care about that we don't even see the larger picture. We lack also, as Jan was pointing out, the shared language around these competencies. What are we doing this for? Can we find a shared language around what it is that is sort of the overarching purpose of all of this? So I think in terms of what can be done in the theme of this convening, which was democracy education needs imagination. It's really imagination and creativity, right? We need creative efforts to be collaborative, and collaboration is hard for anyone who's done it. Like it's fine to do a conference and see there are all these different ideas, but then to collaborate and be like, okay, now who's going to do what? And we're going to get this money and we're going to share this, and no one's going to own the outcome. I mean, collaboration is hard, but it is the only way forward, and experimenting, being very imaginative about how we work together toward these shared goals is number one. But not just, we need creativity around in this collaboration space, first of all, on what we teach, right? To sort of align on, what are the biggest themes, so that we don't have just growing piles of content that kids are supposed to consume, but that we sort of clarify what are the core themes and concepts. That's one thing. But the other is to think about, as also Jan and Tuija were saying, how we teach and with whom, like bringing in new players, bringing in museums, libraries, community organizations, and creating a shared language around outcomes to say, look, if you come into a museum, hey, museum, you can be a site of democratic education by creating a space in which young people deeply connect with an understanding of civil rights. And thinking about not just I present whatever, statues on monuments, or I present Harry Truman, or I present American history. No. I am here to present a window into humanity and to provide an experience that allows kids to develop that understanding. Totally different conversation, right? In dealing with museums and integrating them into our school curriculum that way. Being very creative about using these spaces for dialogue, like new conversations, new people, bringing in artists, bringing in music, making this sort of a multimedia effort to have conversations about democracy, sort of as living democratic practice in our communities, that this is sort of a project that we make a community endeavor wherever we are. Being very creative about how we measure the impact, right? How do we measure whether when a kid goes into a museum and has had an amazing experience where they walk away and are like, oh my God, never again, or oh my God, now I really understand the impact of redlining on communities, to say, okay, how do I measure the depth of that experience so that I can then convey that back to the school system and say, stop lecturing your kids, take them to museums, let them do projects, right? So we have to get creative about measuring this stuff so that it can add up to policy change. One off, and everyone doing their own thing isn't going to add up to any system changing, right? So we have to get creative about finding unified ways to measure, which also means that we need to get creative about connecting with EdTech and technology. There are EdTech firms that are making a ton of money on selling learning management systems and metric systems and learning platforms. That's great. But we're not in conversations with them yet about how can your tool be a tool for building democratic skills in math, in science, in anything. How do I build empathy, collaboration, the skills that Jan was talking about? How do I build those skills into every subject? Doesn't matter which subject, because civic education is all education. But how can we get creative about leveraging those big companies that are just not talking to us because they're being pushed into the world of, where's the money? It's in standardized testing. Well, we've got to pull them into our world or get into their world and engage and understand and go deep. And then finally, I think we have to get really creative about having this conversation be much more intergenerational. This came up with the prior speakers as well. How do we bring young people into our mix to advocate for creativity in democracy education and showcase what they are doing? Young people are getting extremely creative about how they're engaging in democracy. They're using new tools. they're using, whether it's movement building tools or tools to express themselves and to engage other people. That's fantastic. But we're not having them at the table to think about, okay, what does this mean for how we're teaching democracy? So there are efforts on all of these different fronts, right? On each of the things that I listed as creative spaces, but we just need to get better at highlighting them and then finding ways to plug in as people that care so deeply about democracy. Caring and doing what we've always been doing isn't going to be enough, right? We have to just break out of our old mold.
Indeed. Yeah, thank you very much, Fernande. I actually, there was one of also the questions that Ellis in the chat was making regarding how also we measure these skills. And I think that's also important, something that maybe we also should take a burden in understanding how we can really measure what we think it's the competence in these knowledge, values, and attitudes we're talking about, and also how they relate to academic performance. No, because I mean, we've seen this from the work we do in Brazil, that the students we work with on democratic education and similar topics do also have a re-engagement with the school that affects other performance in terms of feeling that the school, it's actually a space for them and not just something that responds to other ways of thinking or interests that are not their immediate needs. So I'm going to pass it now on to Olga. She has long experience working in Colombia with the Ministry of Education, and indeed, she discussed with us about a major reform that was being done in terms of civic education and citizenship education in Colombia. So I wanted to ask you regarding that experience that you shared with us, what advice would you give when thinking about how policies can commit with democratic education in other contexts? So from what you experience, how we can learn from there to push for some of these movements in other spaces. So what can states do at the public policy level to demonstrate their own commitment to democratic education? What are some of the failures or successes and lessons learned that we can draw from in the policy space?
Gracias, Clara. Es momento de cambiar a su traductor. Ya varios han dado respuesta a estas preguntas, pero en el caso de la experiencia nuestra, para ir a lo concreto, para el diseño de políticas públicas y poder emitir algún tipo de recomendación, voy a partir justamente de lo que dice la evidencia, tener en cuenta las recomendaciones de programas y proyectos como los que aquí hemos conocido, que ya han sido evaluados y que tienen evidencia de haber servido. Por supuesto, nos ayuda a quienes ejecutamos políticas públicas a invertir mejor los recursos y no a ejecutar cualquier programa. Justamente también tener en cuenta, como tú lo decías hace unos minutos, el disenso, saber que formar para la democracia y la ciudadanía nos hace pararnos en orillas distintos y distintas a todas, incluso a los tomadores de decisión, y es usar ese disenso incluso como una oportunidad para construir la política pública y no partir de la idea de creer que todos vamos a querer formar en ciudadanía y democracia, porque si no hace eso, que los proyectos no avancen. Ya lo decía mis antecesoras, es importante y es una buena práctica para nosotros involucrar a los niños, niñas y adolescentes, incluso en el diseño de esa política, porque ellos traen la creatividad y la innovación propia de su edad. Y si cruzamos eso con la experiencia y las evaluaciones que los tomadores de decisión y los programas nos traen, pues podemos construir una política mucho más interesante, incluso más democrática, es decir, se hace de eso un ejercicio democrático. Al final alguien toma la decisión, pero en los ejercicios de participación es importante consultar a quienes no opinan igual para tener en cuenta en dónde hay que trabajar y a los niños, niñas y adolescentes porque son el fin último del proceso, son nuestra finalidad más bien. Ya lo decían también, es muy importante, de acuerdo con la evidencia, ya ha funcionado en Colombia en los últimos años, no entrar en la trampa de ver si las competencias académicas son más importantes que aquellas que forman para la ciudadanía. Ya hay evidencia en el mundo, muchos de los que estamos aquí con programas y proyectos que demuestran que el desarrollar estas habilidades para el pensamiento crítico, la toma de perspectiva, el manejo emocional, la regulación de emociones o la empatía, son fundamentales para construir ciudadanía y formar para la ciudadanía, pero además de eso, ya sabemos por esa evaluación que nos cuesta mucho más en los adultos y no es que no lo debamos hacer. Entonces, la formación inicial de los docentes antes de que lleguen al aula para que sepan cómo hacerlo cuando estén en el aula y que no lo sientan como una carga adicional, sino que pasa en su práctica y en su cotidianidad. Eso es importante, por ejemplo. Y además de eso, no dejarle el papel solo a los educadores. Cada vez más es importante donde los niños y las niñas y los jóvenes interactúan en las redes sociales, en los espacios de juego, en la diversión, donde no está la escuela, hay que también desarrollar procesos de política pública. Entonces ahí necesitamos otros sectores, no solamente el educativo, que no quiere decir que la educación no es un eje fundamental, pero todos podemos contribuir con el proceso. También en ese sentido, usar la evaluación. Y la evaluación, sí, hay ponernos de acuerdo en ese piso, cuáles son esas habilidades, cuáles son esas actitudes y comportamientos que queremos promover al curso de vida, pero no centrarla para calificar a estudiantes, sino para saber qué tan democráticas realmente están siendo nuestras escuelas, qué tan democráticas están siendo mis prácticas como docentes, qué tan oportuna y pertinente está siendo mi inversión en política pública, por ejemplo. Entonces aquí la evaluación es para todos, pero justamente para tomar mejores decisiones en política pública. Y hay éxitos de mediciones. Colombia tiene una medición, América Latina ha participado varios países, República Dominicana, Chile, México, Perú, hemos participado en evaluaciones que son estandarizadas, que sí pueden ser costosas, pero tenemos además experiencias cada uno de los países para hacer cosas desde las escuelas y que podemos compartir. Y esto lo quiero atar con los dos últimos puntos, justamente como en términos de éxito nos sirve mucho aprender de otros, aprender de los fracasos de otros también y de las oportunidades de otros. Entonces aquí un muy buen punto es este tipo de espacios, la conferencia para la acción y la generación de redes, ¿no? Como juntarnos, por ejemplo, los países, los expertos, los tomadores de decisión y compartir las experiencias para construir como una apuesta tal vez regional. No quiere decir igual para todos los países porque hay que reconocer los contextos, pero sí por lo menos que nos permita aprender de esos fracasos, de esas evaluaciones. Y concluiría diciendo esto para Clara y para todos quienes nos escuchan y nos ven hoy, es justamente que en términos de los éxitos y de fracasos, hemos aprendido por la evaluación que hemos hecho de manera permanente en las escuelas y los niños y los docentes y nosotros mismos como ministerio, que el desarrollo de estas habilidades para la democracia, para la ciudadanía, varias de las que ya hemos mencionado aquí, para los escépticos, ayuda a mejorar los aprendizajes en matemática y lenguaje. Eso lo ha dicho el Banco Mundial, la OCDE. Para quienes quieren evaluar esto, hay evidencia en el mundo que si contribuimos a formar pensamientos más democráticos, participativos y demás, mejoran las matemáticas y el lenguaje, que también nos interesa a todos. Y además ayuda a construir ambientes más democráticos y ayuda a disminuir la corrupción. Y además, cuando ya estamos más grandes y entramos a un sistema productivo y laboral, nos ayuda a ser más creativos, innovadores y mejora la productividad. Así que es como un gana-gana, como decimos acá, ¿no? Hay que perder un poco el miedo y tratar de usar estas evidencias para mejorar el diseño de las políticas públicas.
Muchas gracias, Olga. Andy, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Olga. I'd actually like to, if I'm allowed, I'm going off script a bit here, but I'd like to just follow up with a question to you, Olga. I think so much of, again, coming back to that, so much what ended up being discussed when we all came together was about the barriers to getting this kind of education prioritized and implemented, or these kinds of practices prioritized and implemented. And I just thought, I've been reading the chat, and Ellis put a point in there of a news story in the UK a couple of weeks ago saying, you know, new evidence shows that sending kids to museums doesn't help improve their grades. And that got me thinking, right? Like one of the barriers that certainly I think came up loads when we discussed, but certainly here in the UK, is that pushback really that from certainly media, certainly parents, and just general societal feeling that actually good grades is the thing we're meant to be striving for. Good grades should be the priority, and that academic rigor should be the priority. And actually, what we're talking about kind of takes away from that and harms that, is that kind of narrative that exists. And I wonder how much pushback you've had in terms of the policies that you've tried to implement and that you work on, whether parents or other parts of society push back against those more citizenship-focused policies and say to you and your colleagues, actually, why aren't we focusing on the academic rigor or the grades themselves? I wonder if you ever faced that pushback in Colombia.
Sí, de manera permanente, Andy. Y por eso tuvimos que hacer una evaluación interna. Entonces lo que hicimos fue invertir recursos para demostrarle a los maestros y nosotros mismos eso que ya decían, por ejemplo, algunos investigadores, Koji Miyamoto, por ejemplo, del Banco Mundial, el mismo grupo de Harvard de Educación, y lo quisimos comprobar en Colombia, que tiene además un reto importante, y es que a diferencia de sus países, Colombia no tiene un único currículo. Cada colegio diseña su currículo y reconoce el contexto. Entonces eso ya es un reto. La evaluación que hicimos entre el 2017 y el 2019 nos permitió concluir que cuando los niños y las niñas están en ambientes de aprendizaje más democráticos, es decir, participan, se les invita a usar la argumentación, a indagar fuentes de información científica para saber si lo que están viviendo en su contexto, si la guerra, el conflicto en el que estamos sucede, por qué sucede, y no solamente porque un libro de texto me lo dice, sino porque puedo cuestionar, preguntar, hacer preguntas difíciles, decimos, ¿no? A los adultos que a veces tenemos respuestas incompletas. Eso nos ayudó en dos cosas. Uno, a identificar que los aprendizajes en matemáticas y lectura y escritura mejoran. Y dos, a bajarle la atención al docente que no tiene por qué saberlo todo, sino que genera pensamiento creativo y le ayuda a los estudiantes a buscar información. Y en los museos hay información, no es la única parte, pero contribuye con el aprendizaje de una manera innovadora. Y lo último, Andy y los demás colegas, es que recién salió el estudio de PISA, de evaluación de competencias lectoras y escritoras. Vayan a los resultados de sus países. El estudio de PISA dice que cuando los docentes tienen climas de aula más positivos, cuando los docentes hacen que sus estudiantes participen más, estén emocionalmente mejor, sus derechos son reconocidos, en lectura y escritura nos va mejor. Hay retos, pero nos va mejor. Entonces es usar esa evidencia, atreverse a hacer evaluaciones en sus contextos y países, y con base en esa evidencia decirle, como dice Sandy, a los que tienen, los que quieren rechazar esto, porque por muchas razones, que ahí van a mejorar las competencias académicas. Hay muchas posibilidades y muchos estudios. Yo aquí he mencionado algunos. El de Colombia lo hizo la corporación, el Banco Interamericano, y lo hicimos con una universidad en Colombia, y de hecho hay una pregunta que pueden hacer los investigadores: generar evidencia, evidencia científica, ir a los colegios, hacer evaluación y demostrar que sí, que estas habilidades para la democracia, la ciudadanía, contribuyen también con mejores aprendizajes en matemática y en lenguaje.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Olga, for sharing all that. That's really helpful, and I think possibly also brings us on to a question that's been asked in the Q&A, and perhaps a broader question I've got beyond that. So I really like this question from Serena, which is, what steps should student researchers take to promote and support such initiatives? And I like that question in part because I think, again, for me, I came into some of these discussions thinking, oh, great, we're going to identify the sum of what works. And I came out the other side thinking, it's actually not about necessarily identifying the what works. It's about how we're going to identify how we overcome these barriers. And that's one of the reasons I like this question, because I think actually, and I think as Olga was just saying, like researchers and people doing that kind of research could play a big part in helping overcome some of those barriers that have been identified. So I guess I want to go to the rest of the panel, I guess, on that question around what could student researchers do, but also on a kind of a bigger question, I think, which is, you know, we've called democratic education, we've called the report and the initiative, Democratic Education Needs Imagination. I guess using our imagination, using sort of free thinking. What can we do to overcome these barriers? What do we do to get past the fact that in so many places, far from being increasingly prioritized, some of the practices and policies we're talking about are being deprioritized and are falling further behind of a very exam-based, grade-based system. So how do we overcome some of those things that we've identified as being the barriers to that happening? Be that resource, be that policy making, be that kind of a public understanding or lack of understanding of really what we're talking about, or even that shared language point that we discussed earlier. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in yet. Fernande.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think one of the approaches is data, right? A lot of it, like, collect data on the kind of learning that works and that develops young people in terms of their agency and their sense of curiosity and all the things they need to then succeed also academically, right? To sort of take a measure of an academic success after 2 weeks, whatever it was in that report, as a proxy for whether that build democratic skills is obviously silly. But how do we collect good data over a long period of time from lots of different data points saying when kids learn this kind of way, they build the skills they need to collaborate, to communicate, to share, to engage in civic discourse. And so one example for that is a partnership that we have now in the US, or that we're just building with the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, which is thinking about, what is the future of assessment? What is the future of education measurement, to direct that entire machine toward measuring civic competencies and outcomes, right? To say, well, if this is the future of learning, then let's make the future of learning about civic competencies, outcomes, curiosity, that is connected to academic success, right? And another thing is just to be, to work with new players in collecting, again, data on new forms of learning, like around learning through play, particularly for the young kids, right? I was just about to put this in the chat. Civic competencies between K5 or 0 to 10, that age group, the best way to build civic competencies, according to research, is through play, right? Play that engages in empathy and collaboration. All the fundamentals of civics are built through play. And the Lego Foundation does an amazing job of researching the heck out of this. So let's use that data in our democracy world to showcase, look, this is how we can engage anyone, anywhere, anytime to be building the kind of competencies we need. I think those are sort of some examples. So finding who can do the kind of research that we need to get the data we need so that we can make the argument for the kind of learning that will really help young people grow as democratic citizens.
Well,
I'm going to put this into the chat along with the sort of, some other stuff.
Yeah, bro, thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on that kind of point of how do we break down some of these barriers? Clara, do you want to jump in?
Well, sorry, no,
I'm gonna go Jan, then you.
I'll let our guests speak, of course.
Go on, Jan.
Thank you. I think aside from research and data on what works, I find that documenting what is the opposite of what we want to see is also helpful, because what I mean is that in Thailand, for example, in my study, I documented how the traditional way of teaching contribute to the kind of attitudes and the problems that we have experienced in Thai society in terms of democracy, and oppression and violations that's taking place. So, I mean, there's no space for example, learning to voice your opinions that are different from each other, and you don't have to kill each other. You don't have to fight if you disagree on something. So that's kind of thing that. So what doesn't work means, like, what contributes to the scenario that we don't want. So it's kind of certain practices that is oppressive learning, or the kind of mind-boggling education that can contribute to something that we don't want to see in a democratic education. So that's one thing I'm thinking of. And the other thing is that I think we need to be communicating with the broader movement, other movements, not just within the education. I feel like when we talk, maybe we talk to each other, and that's interested in education work. But I think to build democracy, it involves everyone. And I think there's movements, women's movement, farmers movement, the urban poor. I mean, all kinds of movements that's going on, and we don't connect. I mean, this goes back to Fernande's talks about creativity and collaboration, even not just within our own group of educators, but go beyond our existing kind of, sphere of interest and influence. How do we do learning with rural people, farmers, I mean, in my country, or with urban poor, with migrant workers, so it goes to other areas that we need to build collaboration and alliances to build democracy.
I could also add to that what Jan said, that sometimes, I don't know, is it a good way always go to the negative side, but sometimes it's a good way to show what is missing or what should we promote. For example, I have used it many times in my pedagogy, that because kind of wake from this ignorance that there is no problems, for example, human rights problems or participation problems or anything like that. And in this case, for example, empathy, creativity in the pedagogical practices are often the good way to wake up people to the relevance and make them more meaningful. And I have to comment in relation to what was going on in the chat also, that is it tough to educate young people? But I have been really fascinated in the recent times that in Finland we have in this early childhood education curriculum also democratic and human rights principles, for example, and the teachers, early childhood teachers have asked, well, how do we go on with this? And we are now thinking about the solutions to that we need to start with really in the early, so early as we can. But also, I have been really excited about those, for example, going outside school, the museums, teaching history, historical empathy, different aspects like that. So I think they are really, really good ways to go forward and make these values and principles to realize in people's head. And when Andy asked about how do we transgress these barriers, I think there is not one solution, as we made in the report also the note that we need many languages. As I have been working in different institutions, well, I think that we in universities people like research language. In policy level, we need different kind of course, research, but some other issues also needs to be what are the practical outcomes and things we need to be doing. And for different teachers, we need different aspects. It's very different to talk about early childhood education or in university teacher education. So, of course, we need many approaches and kind of also creative approaches so that people can join with these issues. But those were the thoughts that came into my mind.
Clara, are you going to come in?
Well, I don't know. Okay, I have my ideas about solutions, but I mean, you all know, and especially you from Protection Approaches when we started these conversations, and how I felt in the conference. I really felt, we didn't expect that we were going to be so much in agreement. And actually, it's not only us, like as we were writing the report, remember the UNESCO Futures of Education report just came out, which was the work of 2 years, how many years of consultations all over the world. And of course, it was much more of an extensive report, but I could just, read some of the same things, like exactly in a like kind of a blueprint of some of the concerns, no? And like I felt very frustrated because I feel so it's not that we don't know what to do, or like other people that have been doing this don't know what to do and how that works, and that we know that it works, and that we know that have also collateral effects in terms of improving other hard skills, or like improving violence issues that in many schools, especially now after COVID, are like escalating in massive manners. But like for me, and I guess this is also for all of us that work in this prevention and identity-based violence, prevention, genocide prevention, is about creating networks and just, you know, making this camp bigger and bigger. And that is, as Fernande was saying, that's very difficult. We had like a great conference, and after that conference, of course, everybody goes back to what they have to do, and that's normal. But you know, in a sense, for me, that's sad that we are not able to transcend or particularities. And that was also something we discussed about consensus. Of course, there are those who say the school doesn't have to teach kids about these issues. That's the role of the parents. We're not talking about this. We're talking about people that have the same goals. Call it peace education, Holocaust education, human rights education, citizenship, democratic education. And we are apart, we are few, or maybe not that few, but like we need to be able to work together, because I think there's a feeling of frustration of like how many enesimal curricula we could do. Like you guys are doing a great curricula in UK schools. We have a beautiful project here in Brazil that is having beautiful impact as well. Jan is doing work. In Colombia, they have also these competences. We know Adrian and like Natalia, like many of the people that were there. And all of this curriculum work and do produce similar results. The problem is that we are talking about obstacles that doesn't allow this to be mainstream, but just continue being anecdotes. And that is the problem. And I think we are seeing it. It's not a coincidence that the world is going the way it's going. And of course, education, we said it's not the solution. We cannot claim that education is going to solve all the problems. But I am a fierce convinced person that it is part of the solution. Without it, I think there is no way out. So anyway.
Thanks for that, Clara, and for all the points just made. And I think, you know, what a lot of you kept coming back to was this kind of movement building, was this network building, was this joining up across sectors and spaces to try and break down those barriers and challenge some of the often very ingrained, very structural issues that prevent this kind of education that we're talking about. I think touching on, there's a comment in the chat from Venant mentioning about like working with state officials, for example, in post-conflict situations where it can be very difficult. And really that puts me more in mind of context being so different in different places globally. I just wonder what people think the value is in the creation of a global movement. So you know, what you're imagining a global movement to prioritize this kind of education and these kinds of practices, or are the local contexts going to be too different for a global movement like that to be useful and practical? And yeah, open question. I don't know who wants to come in on that.
I have super strong feelings about that. As I mean, I'm a German transplanted into the world of the U.S. You know, feeling very much connected between the European conversation and the U.S. conversation, working a lot in Latin America, and then with colleagues in India. So I feel like this idea of nurturing our young people as human beings who have a sense of self, who know how to love, who know how to think about community, and know how to engage and build a society that advances the well-being of all, that doesn't destroy the planet. That's sort of the basics of democracy education, right? And that is a universal project, and one that goes beyond any one state form or not. But that's sort of the very heart of democracy education, is a universalist one. And then there's a lot of adaptation. But if we focus on some of these core things of how do we make sure every young person grows up feeling like they belong where they live, without that, they can't thrive and they will never become democratically involved. If you don't feel that you're seen and you're valued where you live, you cannot engage. So let's start with the basics. Make sure every child feels that they're loved and that they feel like they belong where they live. I mean, it's not that. So I think if we strip it down to the basics of what are the foundational building blocks of a democracy education, that's where the global movement is, whether it's in form of the EAD in the US or the Council of Europe in Europe or something else, fine. But I think a conversation that is global about the bedrock of democracy is really important, particularly since there's such great research coming out that is decolonizing the idea of democracy, right? I'm just reading this awesome book that I can only share this here about a new history of humanity, right? This is about, look, a lot of these democratic principles and these ideals, they're universals, and they're not from the West. They're from indigenous societies. They're from indigenous cultures. So if we have to do a sort of historical redo of our narrative of where democracy comes from, and then it can become a very universalist project, but we need to be learning, right? This is new research. It's anthropology, it's archaeology. This is the beauty of history, that as we keep learning, our ability to become ever more human and more connected just grow. So that's my lack of emotion and my very rational take on this question that you asked.
Thank you very much, and I very much enjoyed the answer. Olga, do you want to come in on that as well?
Yo, Andy, Olga. Para ver si superamos el sentimiento de frustración de Clara y logramos ir a la acción, creo que estamos en un momento del mundo en donde el llamado a la acción está. Es decir, así como estamos nosotros, Clara mencionaba la UNESCO, todas las Naciones Unidas firmaron hace poco un pacto por repensar la educación. Y creo que entonces hay un movimiento mundial diciendo sí, hay que hacerlo. Y sabemos muchos un poco los cómo hay que hacerlo. Pero tal vez hay resistencia en algunos individuos, en todos los países. Y a esos individuos hay que cooptarlos y hay que explicarles de manera, no va a ser fácil, pero nos ha tocado aquí, a eso es lo que llamamos los diálogos improbables, ¿no? Como ven y construimos, y si quieres ser como decir que no, a ver tus argumentos para saber si yo puedo construir algo alrededor del por qué tú crees que esto no es posible. Pero nos toca seguir avanzando. Y un poco reitero para superar, yo quiero que pensemos también en las movilizaciones de los jóvenes en el mundo. En América Latina, las transformaciones se están dando justamente porque son los jóvenes los que nos están obligando a cambiar la forma de actuar y están trayendo esas conversaciones a nuestras casas. Entonces creo que hay un tema innovador sobre lo que todos estamos aprendiendo, y si hay buenas ideas, es sacar esto de la escuela y hacer que justamente en los espacios de diálogo y de conversación también los adultos tengamos esos diálogos improbables con los jóvenes, porque no nosotros, pero la mayoría de los adultos han sido creados en una escuela jerárquica, vertical, en donde el docente adulto toma las decisiones y nosotros los estudiantes, niños y niñas, sentimos miedo por una nota. Esa es la historia de la educación en el mundo, y estamos tratando de transformar ese paradigma de la educación, y no es fácil, pero los chicos nos están forzando a hacerlo. Entonces creo que una buena oportunidad es usar esos espacios de diálogo que ellos y ellas crean para que nosotros los adultos entremos en confrontación. Y cuando digo confrontación no es de violencia, sino de las ideas, de los argumentos, de pensar y construir juntos. Yo no tengo un cómo, pero sé que Clara, esto y colegas nos ayuda un poco a saber que podríamos por ahí ir explorando y aprendiendo los que estamos convencidos de que esta es la manera. Y estamos en un momento en el que la humanidad cada vez es más consciente de que hay que hacerlo. Si comparamos hace unas décadas en donde esa historia de la humanidad que Fernande está leyendo era totalmente distinta, y hablar de los derechos humanos era impensable, incluso en las escuelas. Lo que pasa es que queremos ver cambios rápidos, somos ansiosos, pero creo que hay que ir avanzando y con la certeza de que vamos lográndolo, y que los jóvenes nos están haciendo que esto se apresure. Entonces hay que desaprovecharnos de ese movimiento de los jóvenes para que los adultos y las escuelas avancemos más rápido.
Thanks, Olga. I completely agree with what you're saying, and and thanks for the input. I guess it just brings me then to that question of how. I think we can all agree then that coming together, having a movement of hugely diverse actors, and I mean that in all the ways of diversity around the world, who can support the championing of these kind of education practices we're talking about rethinking, reimagining. Let's go back to the name of the book, reimagining how we do education. And I guess it comes down to the how, and it's what Clara, you were mentioning earlier, right? Around we kind of, there can be great intentions that ultimately never get past that line of great intention to movement building. And I wonder if anyone's got thoughts on that. Jam, are you going to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I used to be quite, pessimistic about this kind of thing, but maybe when I get older, I feel like, okay, we do what we can. But I think this coming together is great, and you get the energy and you get the experience and kind of shared learning from one another. So you get that kind of, you feel empowered to continue your journey, right? But I think one thing I see is important working in a Thai context is with this kind of democratic education. I see someone mentioned in the chat that it's a socialization process. And when we talk about pedagogy, now we want to change the pedagogy to be part of that new socialization, right? And I think working with teachers are really important. So what Tuija was saying earlier, if we want, teachers are gatekeepers. If we can't change the policy immediately, we can't turn things around. How do we work with if you want to say small changes, but with these teachers who are everywhere, and they can somehow have a control over how they run, or how they want to socialize with, in their context, how they can interact with the students. So I think with movements like that, become more kind of spreading movement of teachers who want to reimagine education and change the way they socialize or they teach, despite the challenges, of course, we see about assessment and, exams and all these things. But still, I think there are spaces where teachers can do something, at the school level, at the university level. So I think, again, we need a combination of things: creativity, collaboration, and making use of where we have the power and control to do things. So and while trying to think big, but don't feel so despair, I guess. That's very, of not being able to move beyond what we have already done so much already.
I want to take advantage of this question, and then I know Tuija also wants to respond to also address one of the questions from Pektan, who is, sorry if I didn't pronounce well, asking, is there a case then for a global education curriculum by global citizens with an independent educational organization, a neutral space for discussion and exploitation of ideas? So I actually want to advocate for the contrary. Like, one of the things we discuss is, like, even if there's these universal ideas, that's another discussion. Something we learn is that these things are very much contextual in a way, like in the sense of how they are relevant for different spaces, and actually doing general curricula ends up probably not tackling the issues, because the way in which these issues are represented in different contexts is very different. So it has to be something that is much more nuanced. And that is also why I wanted to go back to this idea of neutrality. Neutrality doesn't exist. That's part of the problem when we talk about, like, these standards and, like, all these kind of, like, presenting something as a science. And it's not a science, it's a choice. And, like, I think that we have some values that, as organizations, we defend human rights, democracy, plurality, diversity. And that's our standing point. And the people who are not defending these rights, they are being heard very strongly lately. And that is at the end of the day, what I think we should be also vindicating. Of course, neutrality in the sense of creating a space where there is voices for everybody to be heard. But like, I think this is not a neutral issue at the end of the day. This is precisely taking a stand for the defense of human dignity and those values that we believe will make this world thrive rather than be destroyed. Sorry, Tuija. I also got emotional like Fernande.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I have to just add that I loved Fernande's comment previously about that. That's really speaks to me also. And I have been thinking, because we have now a lot of talk about reimagining, which is a good thing. We need to reimagine some things. But I have also been thinking about, should we go back to basics in somehow, in this kind of basics values? If we talk about equality, diversity in a minimum universal level. I have been now doing some research on the philosophical foundation. It's not easy, but it's really intriguing, because we have so much talk about silos, differences. So I love to discuss more about what unites us also globally, and also in the context of education. One key aspect is this kind of global interconnectedness that we need to promote in each step, because kind of especially these topics are quite hard in many ways, and nationalism and polarization is increasing, and we should really understand the consequences that if we ignore different conflicts in different places, then it will have global consequences, and now the recent times have been good reminder of that. But the solution is not kind of polarizing and going into your own camps and forgetting all about the basic principles. But yeah, those were the ideas.
Well, thank you so much. I'm afraid we've run out of time, and there's lots of questions I wanted to get to, and apologies if we didn't make it to your question. Amanda, I saw you put loads of questions in that I had plans to come to in various bits, and sadly didn't, and same to others of you who have been kind enough to join us and write questions to kind of input onto the conversation. So thanks so much everyone who has joined. Of course, thank you to kind of all the speakers today, Jan, Tuija, Fernande, Olga, Clara, and also the people kind of behind the scenes, right, who have been doing kind of tech for us and helping out. Delia, Paula, Isa, Sophia, George, who's been doing the interpretation. So thank you to everyone. We hope this can be the start, or the end of the start, I suppose, of a conversation we can all keep having together, because like we said, we hope, if you haven't had a chance to yet, you do get a chance to read the report. You'll see it like us as a bit of a call to action for everyone to think about how we can break down these barriers, how we can work together, how we can build those movements. So really grateful everyone joining. I don't like having the last word, so Clara, I think I'll pass to you to give the final wrap up.
I think there's nothing else to add, just to insist we are very grateful for all of you who have contributed. I wanted to thank Jan, Fernande, Olga, and Tuija for yet another great conversation. We had many of those in the month of November. I also want to thank again to all the participants, those who wrote the papers, those who contributed to the discussion, and insisting in that there is a stance in which we just want to keep advocating to ensure that what we've seen going through history happening to many people doesn't happen to anybody ever again. And education has a role to play in this. And that's where I'm saying we need to stand up and be aware that it's a moment of imagining and reimagining, but also doing. And maybe not only doing curriculum pedagogies, but trying to be more creative about the ways in which we crack down those obstacles we identified as important issues, I think, as we move ahead. Thank you, Andy, Safia, Delia, and Kate from Protection Approaches for this great partnership. It's just amazing to be here today doing this. And as we said, we hope we will keep going and doing more around this. Goodbye to everybody.